Hey there, class. Welcome to lab number 21. Today we're going to be discussing two different subjects. To start, we're going to talk about the commercialization of journals, of scientific journals, as well as diversity and inclusion in psychological sciences. These are both really important subjects within the literature. Additionally, the commercialization access to journals is one hot topic discussed in your Chambers article. So let's go ahead and talk about the first part of what our two-part lecture will be on today, which is paywalls and accessibilities. So in your Chambers article or your Chambers chapter for today, what you read is he discussed how there's subscriptions to most of these peer-reviewed scientific journals are just off the wall expensive, right? So these journals can be for a subscription may be up to $14,000, and that's to access these the science that is pretty important for academics to see. So what has happened a lot of times in universities is they've made it so that only people who quote unquote need this literature often needs it. So only those who academics are able to access them. So, I mean, you just have to try and think, what kind of impact do you think this has for people like policymakers? I think I've worked oftentimes with nonprofits in the past. Like, how do you think that impacts us when we have a paywall to access journals that have scientific knowledge that we need to use in order to conduct studies, to even fill out reports, and to even give information to policymakers in our field? And even think about this in terms of clinicians or and those in the private practice, right? They don't have access to these journals because of a $14,000 paywall that may be open there. So Chambers points out that this is a pretty big deal, right? So he talks about how authors have this ability to pay money to make their articles open access, which is a little bit ridiculous. So think about this: an author is paying money so that their article and their works can be free. But do you think that authors always have the money to afford such a extravagant amount? As you can see on the slide, if you would like it to be published and available to the public for free, they charge you up to $2,150. I mean, some authors who have large grants might be able to afford this, and grants might pay for this ability to make their articles open access, but who's to say that every author has this ability? So not only is it from the author's perspective, they might want to have their work open access. However, in fact, it seems very beneficial to make your work open access to the public. However, that's not exactly the case. So science, in psychological sciences, and this isn't just specific to psychological sciences, but we'll be talking about it in the field of psychological sciences today, is often open to a lot of criticism because of this. The whole point is you can only properly function in research if your results are made open to the community, so that they can be submitted for test and have the scrutiny of other researchers. And additionally, we have to think about how research works, where one research article builds off the other article, and we build off the other article, and we make these little steps towards scientific progress. And obviously, these paywalls that are set towards these high-priced journals and top-tier journals are really making it difficult for us to perform our optimal level of research. So this really, in total, these publication paywalls are withholding a substantial amount of research from a large fraction of the community and society as a whole. This hinders the scientific enterprises and its foundations and hampers its ability to update society. So really, our question for today is it monetizing science? What are the pros and the cons of each? As you can tell from my tone and from the slides here, that I really have a negative tone towards the paywalls and the monetization of science. And what I'll say though, and I want to kind of add on to that, is that we're lucky to live in the 21st century in which the internet exists, because really the internet has revolutionized science and the way that we do science in general. You have to think about, I didn't live in this time. I'm sure, my professors and so forth have lived in this time, but really it used to be the case that, the latest journal would have to be hard printed and distributed out, and, that obviously costs money, which is an understandable kind of costs that journals would have to pay for. However, we live in the time of internet and posting these articles onto the internet and able to have this easier access. However, it seems that these top tier journals are still making it harder to access from our own personal computers without the use of a paywall. So we have to think about kind of the history of where we've come from, of where journals were distributing their scientific journals in this kind of, actual book form and distributing that out monthly or biannually or whatever method they decided to do. But we don't live in a time like that. So we have to think in terms of the 21st century and what it is that we're able to, give out to other scientists as well. Now, luckily, since the turn of the age with the internet revolution, we've seen a great increase in these open access initiatives. And what I'd like to present to you on the slide is an actual flyer for a coalition that entire mission statement is to make this open access statement a reality by 2020, which is great. They've really put a lot of pressure on these higher impact journals to make things free to the public and free to other researchers, free to nonprofits, which is one that I'm a little bit more close to, is these nonprofits having access to these journals, because I've had to sit behind a paywall at a nonprofit before and understand that I am limited because our nonprofit doesn't have the funds to pay for these outrageous journal publishing costs. So the nice thing is that these open access initiatives have put a lot of pressure on these, higher peer-reviewed journals, such as, let's say, one of Elsevier is, has made it so that things like Elsevier have the ability to hold access to publicly fund to knowledge without ransom. So it's a really great initiative that you should be aware of. So another thing is that this organization called Science Europe has coordinated with a lot of federal funders across Europe and other various research councils in Europe to make open access publishing actually mandatory for anyone who received public funding for research. So think about this. Where does a lot of the money, especially in Europe, a lot of the funding for research comes from the public funds. So the ability to make all of that open access is a pretty big feat to have. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case here in the United States, but it's really great that in Europe we have that, and that maybe one day in the future we can model that in the future. So I'd like to bring it back to our Chambers chapter that we read for today's class, in which he talks about this organization called Sci-Hub, which is actually kind of a website designed to kind of pirate these articles. So they're just the same way that you would pirate music or pirate movies in that illegal fashion. This organization called Sci-Hub has actually been designed to kind of recreate that kind of same thing. It's questionably legal, what they're doing, but the entire purpose that Chambers talks about is that if we want to, if we want to be able to have access to these closed off journals, we require this like ability of these, warfare guerrillas, like Sci-Hub, to access these articles and to make things more accessible. So really, Chambers talks about it in a different light than maybe that is in the pirating of music. Now we're pirating scientific journals. So it's kind of an interesting concept, and you would be surprised to see that this actually exists in this academic community, that we're actually at risk where people are doing these questionably illegal things. But it's this access to knowledge that a lot of researchers want and are willing to make that sacrifice for. So it's a little bit interesting to me. Now, there's this at this part of the video, there's actually a link that we would normally be watching in class, and as we've discussed before, unfortunately I can't really make videos work in the format that I'm recording on, but I'll go ahead and post a link to the Canvas for lab module number 21, and it's just a quick 4 to 5 minute video in which they talk about whether to publish on an open access journal or a kind of a journal with a paywall, and kind of the pros and cons of each. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and give you some time to go back to the Canvas modules and click on the link that I've posted for today. Like I said, it's a quick 4 to 5 minute video. It's pretty interesting as well. So I'll go ahead and do that and then come back to this video. So if you've watched the video, you saw that there's actually a lot of things to think about between choosing with an open access journal and your traditional journals with the normal paywall. A few of the points that they made up is, the journal's visibility. The next one would be the cost of publication towards that. Additionally, the cost that you would have to pay to make your journal open access, which again is quite odd to think about at times. Additionally, there's this concept in scientific writing that's called an impact factor. And essentially, that's a score that is given to these journals that describes how much of an impact they can make on the public or on the community they serve. There's a few different impact scales. There's some that scale from 0 to 10. I'm not sure all of them, but it's actually something that is very important when publishing research. I will say that oftentimes when I'm writing a research paper or on a team of writing a research paper with people, oftentimes the question I get is like, well, what impact factor journal will you be writing for? And that really makes a difference. And oftentimes these higher impact journals are harder to get into. So you kind of don't want to, if you don't have a research study that you feel is worthy for these higher impact journals, you generally go down to kind of like a mid-tier impact journal, or if you want to get a quick publication out, it's a low tier impact journal that you're thinking of. So that's just kind of what this idea of impact factor is. And when you're thinking of the idea of an impact factor in a journal, think of the word prestige. That's really what it is. So which journal is more prestigious than the other? And then the last point that they made in the video is about like the speed of publication. If this is a publication you want to get out really quick, well, it might not be be able to do it through the open access as well. So really, it seems like I would honestly want to always make it open access if I could, but this video really does make some points about whether or not you should be going traditional or open access. So originally for this part of the slide, I had us to kind of split up in activities and do a little bit of group activities with each other. However, that's obviously not the case. So instead, we're just going to talk about what kind of open access journals are out there. The main point I want to bring up is this website they called the Directory of Open Access Journals, also known as doaj.org. So you can visit them at doaj.org. And all this is I just wanted to show you that in the social psychology world, how many open access journals we actually have. So we're actually pretty good at leading the scientific community in these open access journals, which is really great, especially because when you think about the research that we do, which is often associated with groups of people and a lot of health initiatives as well, and kind of teasing out those false things that you hear in the media and actually trying to get the truth in there. So it's luckily we are really open to this open access in social psychology, which makes me very proud that we get to kind of stand up with this ability that science is free and that people shouldn't have to afford a paywall to read science and have the abilities, so especially for, again, these nonprofits, these academic researchers, even those that are just interested in research themselves, which is great. So originally what I was going to do is just have you explore this doaj.org website just to get a feel for how many journals out there are open access, your ability to search for certain kind of theories, and seeing what it is what you can learn from this, without even using the university's access to the paywall journals, which, as a researcher, one of the reasons that we oftentimes say, hey, you need to be on the university campus or logged into the university proxy, is because the university pays, thousands and thousands of dollars to give their students access to these journals, whereas this the journals on this DOAJ are all completely free to anyone despite your access to the library. So we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit here, and we're going to be talking about, moving from the open access, which is an extremely important topic, but now we're actually going to talk about diversity in social psychology and why it's important, and some of the consequences that we've faced as a result of not being totally inclusive in our research. So it's really important that in these psychological sciences that we capture the full breadth of the human experience before we can truly say we understand a particular, psychological construct or a psychological phenomenon, right? If we're really trying to understand the rules of the laws of human behavior, it's extremely important that we test every part of that law, looking at different groups of people, because we have to understand that in these psychological sciences, we're often making generalizations about people, and we can't, go with a sweeping brush and saying what these generalizations are. These generalizations need to actually be, very, very accurate as we can make them. So when we're making generalizations, we have to say what kind of groups of people we're indicating, what was the population that we were studying. I think I've kind of hit this on the head. I've really tried to say this very clearly from some of our past lectures, that when you are defining a population that you want to study, it's important to be extremely specific into who you're studying, right? Because without properly defining the population, the sample and the study that you get really makes no sense. So that's what it's all about, is truly defining your population. And part of that is making sure that we are studying as many different populations, or making as good of a generalization as we can with our populations that we study. Um, it's also important that you, as a psychological scientist, broaden your horizon when choosing what to study. Particularly, this relates to kind of the multitude of ethnic and racial life experiences. There's been kind of in past psychological literature, there really has been an insufficient focus on defining what kind of race, culture, ethnicity, and exploring how those concepts shape, world views. So that's a big part of what we need to do as social psychology researchers. And I know we've discussed in the past kind of the racial implications that have been happening in social psychological research. For example, there was a time when they're only studying, upper middle class white males. So what can we generalize to? Well, of course, only upper middle class white males. And just to give you kind of a little bit of how this works and how we found this, cognitive dissonance, which is a highly studied theory within social psychology literature. So this is the idea that oftentimes people feel uncomfortable in certain aspects when they are defining a certain uncomfortable behavior of some sort. So there's these three different tiers to it. So there's the behavior that you perform, there's your thoughts on the behavior, and there's the thoughts that other people have on the behavior, and how that defines how you perform your behavior. So for example, with smoking, oftentimes cognitive dissonance comes into play, where you will say, I'm smoking this cigarette, I know this cigarette is bad for me, however, it's not as bad as people say it is. And you use these different levels of cognitive dissonance to kind of level out um, what it is that will justify the bad behavior or the unhealthy behavior that someone is experiencing. So one funny thing is that we found that actually that cognitive dissonance factor oftentimes is works initially. It was said that cognitive dissonance works on everyone, that there's always a cognitive dissonance process happening within someone's mind when they're performing some sort of unhealthy habit. However, we've actually found, I'll go ahead and credit the research right here. Hazel Marcus and colleagues actually found that really that might work on certain class of people, but we've found that in working classes of people, they don't experience this cognitive dissonance as well. People of lower SES classes, you see choices and unhealthy behaviors as something different. Now, I'm not going to kind of dig so much into detail as to what all that means, but it just shows that really we went a long time in psychological literature thinking that cognitive dissonance was just a broad thing that happened to all people. Um, but really, that's not necessarily the case. We need to look in terms of, even as they should, like SES structure is a very important concept to look at as well with our cognitive dissonance or any psychological theory or any research question you have. So in the previous slide, I talked mainly about kind of diversifying our samples and diversifying our populations of interest. However, now I will need to talk about talking about the increase in diversity of researchers, right? So if we want to improve our ability to diversify populations and of interest and samples of those and even research questions as well, we need to also focus on increasing the diversity of researchers. So, it's important to have this attention to kind of cultural membership and cultural practices, making sure it's a central part to the equity goals and national needs of the psychological field. But it's also equally important for the construction of knowledge as well and the enterprise of science itself. So it's been a really important thing within the field within the past few decades to increase the diversity of those in our field as well. And especially because coming in when we have individuals from a certain background coming into the field as the researchers, they're able to kind of initiate and start the conversation and explain the perspectives of certain individuals, certain populations of interest as well. So it's kind of important that, we don't want to have everyone the same within the field, but important to diversify that. And I think that's really a common trend in not just social psychology. Business organizations are all about this too, increasing the diversity of the boards, making CEOs, diversifying that as well. It's really important to kind of increase this teamwork. And there's been a lot of team research as well to show that more diverse teams oftentimes perform more efficiently, have more kind of creative ideas, are more collaborative in a certain sense as well. So, the ability for us to be more inclusive and study diversity, there's some psychologists out there, and one notable example is Dr. Sellers of the APA, have often argued that we need to change the way that we study people overall. It's from the start, scientists are often taught to be more objective. In fact, that's the main component of science is to be objective, which is something I've always been taught as well. So this isn't a old idea. This is still happening to this day. I've learned that it's very hard. Subjectivity leads to kind of bad science. But this Dr. Sellers of the APA is often argued, we need to take a more something called a perspective approach. In which case we are looking for a variety of perspectives from our participants rather than this objectivity. Now, I don't want to go on and make claims that, objectivity is wrong. Of course, we need to be objective in science. Oftentimes, everything that I look at in my research is completely objective. I try to stay away from the subjectivity as well. But kind of like, let's just go in and get an example. So let's say we encounter someone with a noticeable scar, such as the one on the picture here. So in this scenario, you have two options. You have the option to make assumption about the person based solely on the scar, which would be kind of this more objective approach, in which case you might sort of pity this individual. Or, taking the perspective approach, you can ask the person about it, and in which case you might learn something about the individual that informs you of the perspective of them. So just a way to think about it. So, although that was more of a physical example rather than a psychological example, the same true holds when examining the differences in people's psyche. Asking about measuring these differences and methodologies will provide kind of a more complete analysis than the simply simplicity of making assumptions without asking people themselves, which is this kind of very objective approach. So what this has kind of led to is this support for more qualitative methods and kind of more even beyond that. Kind of my favorite is this mixed methods approach, which is the mixing of these qualitative methods and the quantitative methods, which is where I focus is solely on the quantitative aspect of things, but to kind of combine this, and this can be done through a more through a more diverse research team, right, where we have individuals with qualitative methodologies and individuals with quantitative methodologies, and not prizing one over the other. So really, the idea is that to kind of make this more perspective approach that kind of combines this objectivity and this qualitative research of like a subjective nature, and combining it to make these mixed methods research can be done through inclusivity and diversity. So now that we can talk about, how diversity plays a role in research in both the, thinking of populations of interest as well as the kind of the researchers themselves and how we can have a more diverse team of researchers, we can start talking about kind of cultural sensitivity as well. And in your article that you read by Awad and colleagues, they talked a little bit about this. So, normally at this point is the point where we'd have a discussion in the class about the article and what does Awad and colleagues recommend we do to make our research methods more culturally sensitive so that we can include and make a more diverse group of people in diverse group of populations of interest, and so that we can have better studies overall. So really, there's one thing that they often said is they said to avoid these kind of comparison studies, and you might be asking yourself, kind of why would we do that, right? Comparison studies always seem so essential to our field of study. Well, outcomes may have a cultural explanation, so that Americans do not have. So we need to measure culturally relevant factors. So using the same measure on one culture as another may not necessarily be the case. Oftentimes, this often makes this case that white is the normative kind of way of looking, that we're always comparing against the white culture. So it's kind of this kind of racial bias in which we are saying that white is the normal way of living, or in some way that the Awad article kind of points at. Additionally, they make the point that, data collection of these marginalized groups actually needs to be prioritized. It shouldn't just be the, white community first and then make a priority to then do these comparison studies. We need to build trust building and use culturally sensitive tools to assess these communities as well. So it just really gave a lot to kind of think about, and additionally, another big part, and the part that I really liked about the Awad article is that, they mentioned, we need to disseminate with community groups and other sources to bring out the research to these kind of community groups to talk about this, and not just to the peer-reviewed journals as well. So really, the entire point is to study the population, see where we can help, and disseminate the information as much as possible to these communities. So per usual, our lectures are a little bit shorter than normal. We stopped with the discussion part of class, which was a big summation of what our class was. But as you can remember, as me saying before, this can be kind of split into two parts, this lecture, where we talked about the open access of published research and how it can broaden the reach and impact of science to those, beyond that of the academic researchers. Because what's the point of our science if we can't bring it to the communities and these nonprofits who disseminate their work to these larger communities as well? Additionally, for the second part of our lecture, we talked about the diversity in the field and how it can help foster and improve our understanding of the human experience, which oftentimes within our field, that's what we're focused on, is the human experience overall. So little bit, two different kind of concepts, but really I think you can kind of see how they tie together, how, access to this published research can improve the research to these communities and make more diverse research overall. Additionally, by making access to articles open, we can make the diversity of the researchers who read it and make opinions and publish these articles and read them much more diverse as well, to make a more diverse understanding of the human experience overall. And to finally just end it off, let's just talk about what for next lab. I think you're reading on the screen now that, luckily there's no readings this week, so enjoy your weekend. You just turned in your paper last night. So we'll begin the replicability project next week. So just come ready to work. This Friday we're going to have a discussion exactly how all the details of it is going to go, since everything is moved online, but we'll have a really great project for you.